very warm welcome. As you can see, I'm not Jakub. My name is Egbert Klautke. I'm teaching history at SSEES, and I'm standing in for Jakub, who needed to work and cover the latest developments of the Brexit saga and couldn't be with us today. So instead, you have the pleasure seeing me introducing our panel, which is also changed at the last minute, and I'll explain that just now. We have the task of looking to the future of Europe. We left it to the panelists to define what they think, what aspect of the future of Europe they want to focus on. We'll keep to the same format. We'll have short 10-minute statements, followed by questions and answers. And before we go ahead, I'll just very briefly introduce our panel. We'll start with Eduard Kukan, is a member of the European Parliament, had a very long career in diplomacy and politics. I will only mention that he used to be the Slovak Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1998 to 2006, and served in various other positions for Slovakia. Next to him is Marta Szpala from the Center for East. She's a senior fellow at the Department for Central European and Balkans in the Center for Eastern Studies in Warsaw. Almost as complicated a name of our school. And she focuses on the possible widening extension of the EU in the Western Balkans, and will most probably also cover that in her statement. And our last member is another stand-in, a new addition to our lineup, is Rotifer. He's I think he's involved in the process of music production, recording, transmission, all aspects of what you can do with music. I want to mention in particular he plays guitar. That makes people normally better people. So I think that's something that you need to single out. And he will, I suppose, look at Europe from a non-legal, non-political, non-technical perspective, I think, which also will be a great addition to our discussions. So we'll start in the order that our panelists are lined up here. The only thing I'm going to do is, after 10 minutes, politely but firmly remind you of those, if necessary, and else I'll leave the floor to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I have no intention of going over time here, and you know, it's actually lovely not to be introduced as a journalist for a change, because that's what I make most of my bread from, and I can't help but through Brexit that bread has become bigger, you know, and more fruitful, because of course even those of us who have been reporting on culture before now find themselves reporting on Brexit, you know, and I couldn't not mention it, you know, with Jakub not being here, and, you know, obviously it hangs over all of us. And I think one of the misunderstandings about Brexit, one of the basic misunderstandings, is that people always think it's about the economy and trade deals, maybe about politics, but of course, when you have the spectacle of a Brexiteer quoting, or rather reading out a whole Alfred Lord Tennyson poem, then you know that it's really about none of these things, essentially. But yes, it's about feelings. You know, we remember the Article 50 letter that Britain sent out had this wonderful line in it saying, you know, Britain never actually lost its sovereignty, but it felt like it. And obviously it's also about identity. And crucially, I would say it's about culture. Essentially so, and luckily this is something that I'm used to talking about. So speaking from my personal experience, I moved into this country in 1997. At the time in the 1990s when the enlargement of the EU was only getting underway, but at that time, you know, Austria, my country, had only just joined, but at that time it seemed obvious to my generation that London, you know, the UK and specifically London was Europe's only truly global place. So London was the global city you looked at if you wanted to move outside of your own cultural borders. And that word soft power was mentioned a lot in the previous panels, and I think we can agree that Britain's biggest soft power for a long time has been and still is popular culture. And I would say that over the last 5 to 6 decades, there's been obviously a cultural hegemony of Anglo-Saxon popular culture on a global level, and it's that kind of globalization that we all, you know, like, enjoy, maybe even without noticing. But it has noticeably been fading for a while. And basically, I think two things have happened at once. Locally, in Europe, popular culture, local popular culture has strengthened, and therefore popular culture has regionalized. And I think that's a bit counterintuitive, because we all thought with the arrival of the internet everything was going to get more global. We thought that before we were aware that the internet would create bubbles. And you might wonder what that has to do with now the future of Europe in general, but I said before, like Brexit is essentially about culture, and the same applies, I think, to the future of Europe, with or without Britain in it. So I remember, for example, vividly an evening here in London, relatively shortly after the referendum. It was UNIC, you know, that organization, umbrella organization of all the European cultural institutes of various nations. And naively, I went there and tried, you know, traumatized by the Brexit referendum, what it could mean and how we could all, you know, change the way the public mood was going, you know, that hostility, counteract that hostility by trying to interest some of these people in creating something like a music festival together. And as I said, it was very naive, because the reaction from everyone in the room was extremely negative. You know, people said, no one wants to hear our bands. But interestingly, what a lot of them said, but we do get classical musicians over. That always works. And of course, this is not a coincidence, because there is a clear idea, and you know, we're talking about the future of Europe. There's a clear idea when people think of European culture, and you conjure it up in your mind. You see imperial palaces, you see ballet dances, you see folk music, whatever. European culture is basically set in the past. And we had a lot of talk here today already about backwardness. And coming from Vienna, I really know what this means. You know, we still have Italian opera, which we now see as something that is inherently Austrian, when it's clearly, you know, essentially European, but in the past. And conversely, in Britain, since the arrival of pop culture, there's always been this assumption that anything that happens here currently has the whole world as its potential stage. You don't get that anywhere else in Europe. And this hasn't just been important for Britain, but it's also been important for Europeans. You know, European artists, designers, musicians, filmmakers, they have found a global stage to perform on here. You know, if you go to Tate Modern and you look at the Franz West exhibition, to mention an Austrian artist here, you know, I'm not so sure that in any other European capital you could provide that sort of pat on the back, which is a global one. You know, you need a lot of confidence as a place to be able to say you've arrived, and London's always had that, arrogantly so, but it's also true. And the flip side to this is that because Anglo-Saxon culture is seen as global culture, anything penetrating into it from Europe was often encouraged to exhibit difference, exoticism, to emphasize national tropes, you know, the outsider artist, the freak, if you like, stick to your own thing, you know, show them what's different about you. And on the continent, in the meantime, there's been this need to provide a recognizable alternative, an understandable, immediately understandable alternative to Anglo-Saxon cultural hegemony that has led to what I think is a retreat into parochialism often. And, you know, I'm aware that this is a pejorative, and yes, it also goes along with often with narrow-mindedness, and also, crucially, what doesn't happen here, but what happens in a lot of European countries is that it includes the influence of the immigrant, it excludes the influence of the immigrant. Homegrown immigrants can deal, they can become hip-hop artists, they can enter a global culture, but they can't enter your European national culture, and that's a crucial difference. And I have curated and overseen a rather big public festival in Vienna over the last 10 years called the Wiener Popfest, and I've noticed how singing Viennese dialect, which was seen as provincial by my generation, is now very popular in a way that it never was for me, but because it addresses people directly and stays, though, within only a very local reach. It doesn't even move. If it goes to Switzerland, that's very far. And before, one of our panelists has mentioned the road to nowhere, and everyone knew what he was talking about. That's the power. That's the collective imagination that we have through Anglo-Saxon popular culture. And my problem now, what I want to come to the point finally, is that I've heard a lot of complacency from people about Brexit from my old country, Austria. It's just, let them go. I can't wait to see the back of them. Terrible Brits, let's get rid of them. And I think, culturally speaking, this is rather dangerous. I think there's been a lot of talk about diversity, which is great, but diversity on its own is not very good at collective experience. And I'm asking myself, without Britain in the EU, is there a future, not just a past for European culture, or better still, is there a Europe in a global culture without Britain? And I don't really see that yet. And it's just possible that there will be a cultural, or I think maybe it already is happening, that there's a cultural counter-reaction to Brexit. That there, from the British side especially, there's a new desire to overcome the barriers that separationist politics have erected, or not, we will see. But it's already obvious, I think, to someone living here that the cultural arrogance that you used to see in London is replaced by gestures of curiosity, open-mindedness. And I'm wondering if there might not be a huge challenge to use this moment and fill this hole of a common progressive idea of modernity, contemporaneity, that is, maybe European. And, well, where does it go on? This is the problem when you write your scripts while you're on the train. Oh, here, yeah. I'm aware, I've read Robert Menasse's book, The Capital too, as you might have, and so I know how unimportant and ridiculous all this talk about culture will feel to some of the pragmatists in this room. But, what's on the other side of it? If you don't have that global idea of culture as well, apart from the diversity, provincial culture in the end favors isolationism politically, and it's been said that there should be less cultural politics, less identity politics, but there can also be communal cultural politics. Funnily enough, you see it in practice in the cinema. When you go to the cinema, you see it in practice quite well. I think better than most other art forms. There's European integration and cooperation that really works. But I think there will have to be an effort on Europe's part to not just represent, but to invent as well. And you only have to read that that other popular book, Julia Boyd's Travels in the Third Reich, to see what it is like in a Europe where there isn't any collective popular culture, and how dangerous that can be. So, in the end, that I agree with Jiří Příbran when he says that Europe has no other choice but to be multicultural, but I think my point is, whether Britain Brexits or not, don't leave London alone culturally would be a bad idea.
Thank you.
So, thank you very much for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be here. As you mentioned, I'm mainly dealing with the Western Balkans, and I'm rather focusing on the practice of European policy towards the neighborhood. But I would like to start with answer to the question what Central Europe gives to European Union. But I think we should you should put it otherwise. What would happen if the Central Europe would stay outside the European Union or European communities? And we have this feeling, especially in Poland, that in 1989, Poland was on the same level of economic development as Ukraine was. So the GDP per capita was the same. And now you see, after all these years of transition, where Poland is strong, dynamic in economic terms. We have strong institutions, and despite all the problems we have on internal level, we can see that the country institutions are rather in good shape, and when we look at the society, which is vivid also when we are speaking about the civil society in the region, and in Poland especially, we can see what we gain and what Europe gain as such. So we have the stability, we have this border, this area of instability move far east towards our border, and we see in what shape Ukraine is now, with contested statehood, with economic problems, with a lot of corruption. And when we compare Ukraine and Poland now, we can see what the European perspective, how European perspective changed both countries, and also make us to implement all the reforms and create the modern state in Poland especially, but also in Slovakia, Czech Republic and Hungary. So I think that, of course, when we compare our countries to the European Union, we can see there is still a gap on the different level. But when you compare our region with the region which is outside the European Union, we see what the difference is to be in European Union. And that is also the answer to the question, that we have the more stability in Europe at such. We don't have problems with contested neighborhood. We don't have problems with minority politics in the region. And that's what European Union normative framework gave us. And I think we are now, after 2 panels, that we are forgetting about what European Union was before, and was before 10 years ago, and we are forgetting that European Union used to mean that we used to call the European Union as the soft, normative and transformative power, and the Central Europe is the best example how the European Union perspective can change the situation and can make can force political elite to implement the reform. And now, when we are observing how European Union is playing as a global actor, this is the problem, that we are not speaking about this. So the European Union, or the members of European Union, now focusing on the internal problems. We are, from 2008, we are debating internal problems on the different level, the economic crisis, the euro crisis, the migrant crisis, that we are focusing about, we are forgetting about our neighborhood and what is going in the southern neighborhoods, especially in the Balkans, but also in the eastern neighborhood. And in the meantime, we somehow lost this transformative power, but we also lost the ambition to change our neighborhood. And I think this is the biggest challenge and the biggest problem. And I think without Great Britain as a member of European Union, this process will go deeper, and that we somehow resigned, or we somehow abandoned this ambition to change our neighborhood. And I think this, for me personally, it is the biggest problem, because we used to think about the European Union as a power which implement strict and fair policy towards the region, which set the condition which should be fulfilled, and then when the conditions are fulfilled, we proceed with the integration. And the Kosovo example was mentioned, and our policy is not longer fair, and it's no longer strict. So we have the Kosovo which fulfill all the conditions for visa liberalization, but because of some internal problem of European Union, we decided not to give Kosovo visa liberalization. The same case is with Albania and Macedonia North. So both countries implemented a very challenging reform. Macedonia decided to change the name of the country, but we are still hesitating about opening the accession negotiation. And I think this is the one thing. The second thing is that we were talking about the values here, but in the neighborhood, the European Union stopped to implement or to promote democratic values. So especially in the Balkans, we rather support non-democratic leaders which are in power. It is especially the case in Serbia, and we see when you see all the reports about the rule of law in the region, we can see that the countries in the Balkans are closer to European Union, more advanced in integration with EU, but at the same time they are less democratic. So somehow European Union now is seen as a supporter of non-democratic elite in the region, and we have the protest movement in the Balkans right now. We have the protests in Albania, in Kosovo, in Montenegro, but no European flag. And this is the problem, that European Union, it's not seen as the supporter of democratic movement in the region, and this is somehow which is lost, and it is something which is hampering our position as Europe, as the global power, as the country, as the institution or organization who would like to change and provide and conduct the active policy towards the region in the neighborhood, and somehow it is like short-sighted policy, which probably would make all the region less stable than it is right now, and it is not only influencing our policy in the Balkans, but also in Eastern neighborhood. So 10 years ago, we started to conduct. We established the Eastern Partnership, which was also the concept of changing our Eastern neighborhood. But now with Balkans outside the European Union, we can't speak about the active policy towards the region. We see what is happening in Ukraine. We can observe the Belarus, which is more closer and more integrated with Russia than it was than what was before. Not speaking about the countries like Georgia, which also don't have the membership perspective, and somehow European Union focus on the internal problem. It's not speaking about any ambitious agenda in the neighborhood, which not only hampers our vision of Europe as an attractive model of democratic governance, but also hampers our position towards any global power like China, Russia, or United States. So we used to see the United States as a hard power who stopped the war in the Balkans, but we European Union were supposed to create the democratic states in the region, and after all these years we can see that it didn't happen because failures in our policy. What is also interesting that it was always like I'm at that age that European Union was this attractive model of governing in the region, and now we can see from the Balkan perspective that it is rather China which gives the narrative to the region, or some hopes to change because of some some huge economic programs which is devoted to the region, with the concept of Belt and Road, which gives the region hopes of economic change and some economic development. Also, Russia is more and more seen as maybe not an attractive model, but as a concept which is also, let's say, effective. And Russia is putting a lot of investment into communication strategy in the region, which is also undermining our position, which is this communication. We can see this influence of Russia on the media in the region, and which creates the vision of European Union as organization in crisis, which doesn't give any chance for change for the people in the region. And I think that we all in the Central Europe have this fear that with Brexit, the European Union as such will abandon the active policy to the region, and that's why Poland engaged into the Berlin process, which is now the concept introduced in 2014, which was supposed to enhance economic development of the region, with new connectivity agenda, with new investment into infrastructure, with the security policy oriented programs introduced by Great Britain, and with this concept that some changes could be bring to the Balkans as such. But I think we are talking a lot about the internal problem, but we should also think and reflect on how the European Union is seen as a global power, and with all this, I said, focusing on national interest in the region, we are forgetting how to conduct the active policy towards the neighborhood, and a lot of problems which are coming with not stable Balkans. We have the challenges to this internal security, especially in the Great Britain, connected to the organized crime coming from the Balkans. We have the problems with this non-democratic regime there, but without active engagement we can't change it. But somehow European Union decided not to conduct more active policy and more engagement to the region, but decided to close the door and leave the region behind. And I think in the long term it will create more problems, especially to the Central Europe, the countries which are in the closest neighborhood to the Balkans, as Hungary, as Czech Republic and Slovakia. So we asked Poland with the summit in Poznan in July this year. We hope that Great Britain will stay engaged in the region and help us, but also these countries in the European Union who are still interested in the Balkans, to change and to provide some new concept how to finish the democratic transformation in the region.
Thank you. Mr. Kukan, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks the organizers for having invited me for this important conference. I'm sitting here since the morning listening to the presentations of the panelists and the inspirational discussion. Before I start my remarks, I have to tell you that you will notice it. You are all politologists, analysts, think tankers, journalists. I'm a politician who was living the previous 10 years in the Brussels bubble. So my intervention will not be as dramatic or as juicy as yours. I will say a few remarks concerning the future of Europe. Of course, these remarks can be only telegraphic because they were mentioned many times. And in order to analyze everything to the details. As Professor Żurawski said, we would need 3 or 4 more conferences. And we shall speak about the enlargement. And if you ask about the Turkey, for that not 1 conference would be enough, maybe even more. Okay, so let me start saying that the European Union is on the crossroad. Not only because of the Brexit and the uncertainty it created, and there are many uncertainties, but also because of pressures that revealed themselves in the course of the previous crises. I will use simple terminology. The economic crisis, the Greek crisis, the migration crisis, and the Brexit referendum all follow shortly one after the other and touch the very foundation of the European Union. The European Union is work in progress, not an end stage to itself. It has been developing from the inside and growing outside. The last year showed many deficiencies of these developments. Naturally, we will need a time for, call it either reflection or reaction, or reflection leading to reaction. There will be soon a demand to draw a new perspective for the EU, assessing where do we stand now and projecting where do we want to move from here. It is clear that the current environment, as many of us do not even realize, is unprecedented in terms of peaceful development in Europe, welfare we had created, and security on many levels that have guaranteed to our citizens. There are, however, changes in the international order. Just mentioned the development in the United States, China, Russia, Middle East, but also internal development within the EU, slow growth, aging population, migration, rule of law, etc., which should make us realize the need to act more purposefully. Moreover, we are in the middle of the ongoing internal political discussion, such as the core of the EU and multi-speed Europe. We can also observe broadening division between the North and South and East and West. Brexit is partly the symptom of inability of the UK to find a real purpose and have a true reflection on what the EU represents. The EU is not about how much you pay and what you get back for that. This, unfortunately, has been the underlying thesis of the debate on the EU membership, but it is right to simplify it in these terms. The purpose is much greater. It is the idea of a united and prosperous continent which guarantees freedom and security for its citizens. We always need to keep this in mind when we discuss the future of Europe. EU membership opened new opportunities to Central Europe. Suddenly, Central European countries were not hanging somewhere in the middle in its post-communist reality. They could become an active part of the EU creating for European future. 15 years ago, when we boarded the European Union, it was us with the positive prospects. We saw the future more brightly as we joined a group of the most developed and democratic countries. In these 15 years, Central Europe took on challenges quite seriously. Not only did we catch up with some of the so-called all member states, but we also took up responsibility for our neighbors. Notwithstanding the current political climate in this part of Europe, Central Europe started to play an important role in the Western Balkan region and an Eastern neighborhood. It is because not only they seek for the new markets, but we naturally connected by borders, Schengen area, culture, people-to-people contacts, and many other aspects. We had understood that our neighbors are guarantees for our prosperity and stability in the Europe, for us Eastern neighbors as well as Western Balkans. Moreover, at some point our success stories of integration and transition became an example for the countries of this region. There is an understanding between partners who recently went through the difficult transition process. Countries of Central Europe, therefore, often stood in defense of this neighbor. I think, however, that our role should be the one of a supporter and guardian of the European Union values. Unfortunately, with the current developments putting Hungary and Poland under the scrutiny of Article 7, such role is now questionable. Central Europe could have a strong voice within the EU. We share issues where we find common interest. We saw it numerous times during the negotiations on internal market, dual quality of products, or energy policies. Yet currently we barely act as a constructive joint front in issues central to the European project. At this point, we can hardly be positive examples for the rule of law, justice, and freedom of media, or even civil liberties when these have been under the attacks of the region. I stop here and I will react to some issues which were mentioned in the discussion. Our distinguished friend from Kosovo took the floor twice. I think he deserves the answer. Basically, I agree with you. You are an island of discrimination in Europe because the visa-free regime, these things is not for government, it's for people, it's for persons, it's for human beings. And you are right that you have fulfilled all the requirements, not so smoothly. You had to define your border with Montenegro. It took you a lot of time. You lost a lot of time. You cannot convene the meeting of parliament because opposition was throwing tear gas and paprika spray in order to prevent the meeting of the parliament to approve that agreement. Okay, that's done now. And, I was 10 years Minister of Foreign Affairs of my country. I had to watch each word I uttered. Now I'm enjoying the freedom I was elected by citizens of my country. You were very diplomatic. You said that due to internal problems it was not done. You know how it works. Commission would write a report with the recommendation to start using the visa-free regime. Parliament, we always support, we are the staunchest supporter of the enlargement and visa issues for Kosovo, and then it goes to the Council. Council is the body which decides. And it is enough that one of the member states has some bilateral problems with you, they don't like, and that you are finished. Because and I consider this very undemocratic, not right, not fair, and absolutely wrong. The member state used this, and they are going to use it again. I'm convinced about that. So keep speaking about the unfairness with which we are treating you, and don't make any mistakes back home in internal political scene. And there are many in the European Parliament and the European member states who are supporting you. Not everybody. I'm from Slovakia, one of the 5 non-recognizers. But I can tell you that Slovakia and Kosovo have absolutely normal relations, economic cooperation, we exchange political visits and so on forth, but we don't recognize. And now we all hope that the dialogue will be unfrozen by the new High Representative, because Madame Mogherini will do nothing, unfortunately, and without her and without some gentle or brutal push from outside, you cannot go on with this dialogue. And it seems that we are going to the finishing line. There is already the picture how it should look like, and that then you will resolve the status issue, which is very important for you. Somebody mentioned demonstrations in the Western Balkans. Yes, they are going on. but please don't consider it as the Western Balkans spring. No, like Arab Spring, we were all, celebrating, and very soon winter came after Arab Spring, so we should be more cautious and shouldn't make to the conclusions very, very quickly. I'm still with the Western Balkans. You mentioned it, that kind of political culture of boycotts is developing. There are boycotts in Albania, boycotting the parliament. They are going to boycott maybe the elections. Yes, opposition in Serbia, Montenegro, and that's bad. The word boycott is not welcome in the European Parliament. As we always say that Parliament is the place where the political wars should be waged, and not in the streets or outside it. And to stop, because I will go into many details, whatever discussion will be about the future of Europe, I think that one of the issues which should be discussed in that connection is the enlargement process. Because maybe it will not be the top priority, but it is there. We have made promises twice to candidate countries and aspiring countries, one in 2003 in Thessaloniki. Now the second time after 15 years, Bulgarian presidency organized the Balkan summit in Sofia. It didn't bring anything new, but it confirmed what was done before. And it's more and more difficult. Some countries or some politicians think that enlargement is over. It's not possible. The Western Balkan is on the geographic map of Europe. They are not integrated. And if we want to fulfill the dreams of the far-sighted European politician to have the Europe one and the whole, we have to integrate the region of the Western Balkans. Not tomorrow, it will take time. 7 years, 8 years. I didn't agree with Jean-Claude Juncker when he was mentioning the deadlines. It's very tricky in politics. Then if you don't fulfill it, it backfires on you very much. But the date 2025, maybe for Montenegro and Serbia, even for me, seem realistic. And the enlargement will be successful only when both partners will take it as a joint project. You have to deliver results. There will be new parliament, God knows who will be there. Several of the experts on the Western Balkans are not standing the election, so you have to work even more to give the concrete things to help you. And the European Union also, the Commission, we have to be serious. And that is another thing which I don't like. We give you concrete requirement, concrete criteria to fulfill. You fulfill it, and that is our turn to deliver. And we say, no, it's okay, but we need track record or something else. So it's not serious. And we are undermining the credibility of the European Union in the Western Balkans, and we are working against us. So future of Europe, one of the things which I think will be very important, I exhausted my time. Sorry, we should really take the enlargement process and behave responsibly. Thank you.
So, if there are questions, despite the lack of oxygen or general exhaustion, I would very much encourage you. Please, here's one in the front.
Thank you very much. Well, it's extremely difficult to predict the future. Nevertheless, taking into consideration some basic facts, the starting point of today, we have to admit that the largest country of the European Union, that means Germany, last time needed half a year to create government after elections, after parliamentary elections, for the first time since 1949. Yeah? The second largest country, Britain, is in Brexit. The third, France, socialists and Gaullists were marginalized during last elections, that means traditional parties. The new political power, La République En Marche, emerged and now is confronted with a deep crisis. For more than 20 weeks there are street riots. Next we have Italy, that is ruled by a mixture of Five Stars coalition of the movie comic and the former separatists from the Northern League. Yeah? And then we have Spain with Catalonian problem and the government that has just collapsed. This is the starting point for today to analyze what is going on and what will be the future of the Union. So my question is, what were the problems that provoked that situation, and whether you can see anywhere any project how to go out from that troubles? Now, if there is any political power in Europe that will have political potential to create the program and then to push it through the institutions in order to reverse that extremely unfavorable direction of developments. Thank you.
Any responses?
Maybe you can collect 2-3
Yeah.
questions.
Are there any more remarks, questions?
Do you want to answer? You should.
If you, yeah, there's one.
If we are talking about European security, do you ever see Russia joining the EU?
Russia joining the EU.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for these presentations. And while I was thinking about it, it occurred to me that Europe, that the distinctions that we were talking about today, there were many. But one of them which wasn't mentioned explicitly was the difference between open society and closed society. And I think you beautifully put it in terms of culture. Yeah, that you have you have societies which are culturally open and they absorb different cultures, like London. London is just an amazing place in this respect. But also the question is whether you have cultural policies that are open or closed. And being in Austria right now, I was amazed how carefully you think of Austria as like provincial, closed mind, conservative, but how the system of luring talent from outside with the system of grants in education, in culture, it benefits Austria enormously. And I think this is something which is different between old and new member states, that new member states don't have this cultural policy of opening up towards economic, political, cultural influences from outside. And I wonder whether this is also a question of candidate states and policies which shape relationship of the Union towards its outside. How much does European Union want to remain open to getting new member states? And the crisis that we just heard about, my question is, isn't actually the crisis of the European Union illuminated by its inability to finally unify Europe, Western Balkans and others? So my question for Ukraine would be, somebody mentioned, Russia, member state of the European Union. Can we imagine Ukraine as a member state?
Just say something about what you mentioned about Austria. because you are quite right that Austria feels like a country that is very willing to absorb talent, as people often say, from outside. But you know, also when I walk through Vienna now, I'm aware in certain districts that there's a huge, which is historically pre-EU, Turkish diaspora, for example. Now, you know that in Austria there's a huge resistance, popular resistance against Turkish accession to the EU, because it seems there are certain kind of foreign talent that we like to absorb, and another kind that we would rather keep at arm's length. You know, that we would rather not extend the same rights to as we do to European citizens. So I think there's you know, a lot of double standards there, and I think what you said obviously also deserves a response, because clearly, you know, what unites the places that you mentioned and the crises is that we have, you know, you can say it's a European crisis, you could say this, it's national crisis, but I hate to say you know, someone had to say the B word, someone has to say the N word. I think the neoliberal model for Europe has created a huge problem, and I think it's undeniable that if you look at certain places in Spain and in France, when you go off piste a little, or very much so in Britain, you can see, you can understand, you can see how the European model economically has not worked for everyone in terms of social mobility, and you know, I think you know, because I mentioned the cultural, but obviously, you know, there's also a certain amount of window dressing going on that we're all engaged in, and we all like to signal our openness. But I think economically and in terms of fair treatment to everyone, that is a whole different issue that needs to be tackled, but very actively. Yes.
Further.
I have a problem with the word unification, because I don't think the common Europe means unification. It's rather definition of common interests, and which I think this is one of the problem now we have, that we focus more on protecting national interests than thinking about what is the common interest. And this idea of unification, I think it's, you know, it is impossible to gain because of course different geopolitical position, different economic potential, and we rather should think about how to adjust to this difference as a community, as the European Union, and this should be the priority. But I don't see any political force on the European level who is now able to somehow create such a program for whole Europe. I think that from, like, of course we as a community we have still problem with digesting the 2004 enlargement, and I think especially in the old part of Europe today we mention if the Central Europe is able to speak about its interest. I think it is able, but it is not always heard, especially in Brussels. So this is somehow the problem, how to adjust to these different policies, different areas, different strategies in the common Europe, because like, I think common Europe and the European Union is stronger. It of course it makes our members more relevant, and these divisions and playing on division in European Union, the strategy which is against the interest of all members. So we rather choose things which what unite us, but not unificate us. Let's put it this way. When we are speaking about the openness, of course Poland is a specific case because it was always homogenic, or after the Second World War it was a homogenic society, but I don't think we have a problem with openness to the different countries, especially when we are speaking about the Western Balkans. The support for enlargement is like 80%, so we are like really keen on bringing the new states to the European Union. We see how European Union changes, and we think that this model should be used also in the Western Balkans. And when we are speaking about the openness of Polish culture, we can see, like we have 1 million of Ukrainians in Poland, and we see how quickly they are integrating to the Polish society, but also how they're influencing our cultural sphere. Let's put it this way. And because like we in Poland, like I'm not from Warsaw, and we have different historical background in the different region of Poland. So I think this conscious of different cultural models is high in Poland, and we can see how the different region in Poland differs from themselves, how they are stick to the different values, and I don't think that Central Europe is more closed than the old one. And speak about the Ukraine as a part of European Union, like we have some challenges, which is quite obvious, especially with contested statehood. So it's the same problem as the Balkans. The borders of the Ukraine aren't set, and of course the challenges to the transition process in Ukraine are huge. But I think the Ukraine is also good, or I should say bad example, how prolonged transition is not beneficial for the countries, because we can see that how the oligarchy are now deeply rooted in the Ukrainian system, and it's really hard to be changed in the long term. But we also see how the Ukrainian society has changed, and I think like it is really more and more European, and we see that it is possible. And yeah, so I think. And Russia. As a part of common market or community of values, like I think that the modus operandi of Russia is completely different from the modus operandi of European Union, and we see that this is rather aggressive expansionism, and
but that's today, 30 years ahead, which is what we're looking at. What's to say that Russia couldn't change?
I think it's like really long tradition of the way the country is shaped, so I don't see any possible change in the foreseeable future. Let's put it that way.
Professor Żurawski put a $1 million question. Maybe you know the answer the best. What to do to unite different countries more, not to unify, to unite, because we, as you rightly said, we see that after the elections in the countries which you mentioned, it takes a lot of time. You didn't mention Belgium, that it can last 1 year and a half or something. I have only one answer, that we shall need more serious, responsible politicians, the leaders. There is a lack of leadership in the European Union, unfortunately. That was not only economic, financial crisis, there was also crisis of leadership. And that can change the situation, because I'm sure that we all would agree that we want to keep the European Union as the global player. But if we are serious about it, we have to do something for it. We are good at rhetoric, but decision-making process within the EU, it's taking a lot of time. We don't see ourselves as European first and then Poles second. We are all, and that is the situation which is very difficult to change. And I really think that only when the people start thinking differently, it will be possible to make a small steps forward, because it will take a long time. You know that Lisbon Treaty, you know very well, that brought 2 new posts in the European Union. President of the Council and High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Defense Issues. That was the reason for the High Representative not to have united foreign policy. We shall never have, but we can have common foreign policy. And when Madame Ashton came to Foreign Relations Committee and we were telling her you should do something like that, I cannot do anything. I don't have the agreement from all the member states. And I thought, you cannot wait. Your post is to go and try to coordinate. So I don't see much changes in coordinating. You know, sometimes when we vote in the United Nations, European Union votes 5 different times, and Federica Mogherini started very well, but didn't last long. And now we are waiting for the new High Representative, because her or his role can be very substantial. But you know, you say this and then say that Council needs somebody who is not so strong so that they can deal with him or easily, and you can find arguments after arguments. That has to stop somewhere, and otherwise we shall be laughing stock for the rest of the world. So my answer is only the more responsible, serious attitude of the leading European politicians, and we are very much in need of the new leaders. Concerning no, I cannot imagine Ukraine being member of the European Union. If you talk to them, they would tell you that we want to be member in 10 days. No, and NATO maybe tomorrow. That's what they tell, but you know it's not possible. And I think that Ukraine is a very, very unhappy country because the neighbors of Ukraine are not going to change. For Putin, it is absolutely enough to keep the situation as it is now. Here and there to increase the tension so that the government of Ukraine cannot concentrate on the economic reforms which they need most, very, very dramatically. And we do not realize, many of us, that there is going a war in Ukraine, a regular war in our neighborhood. People are dying. The central government has to support people who are living there. They have to send them salaries because they cannot work. Ukraine is very rich and perspectively very rich country, but you know it's a country governed by oligarchs. Some of them have their own army. So to put their own house in order, they could play a very important role in the international relations, but objective situation is such that I'm very skeptical. No, it's not possible not to use the diplomatic language. I don't think it is possible. Our Slovak former Minister of Finance, Ivan Mikloš, one of the best brains, he's working as an advisor to the Prime Minister of Ukraine. And he likes it very much. And when I ask him, Ivan, what have you achieved? You know, we cannot show anything for his engagement. He's really fantastic. He tries to do everything, but it's not enough. I don't like to be so defeatistic but I don't see any real possibility unless the mood in the Kremlin will change. And it's equally pessimistic to expect because you were asking about the Russians. You know, we have the worst relation possible. We are in the sanctions regime. And believe me, there are many states who are waiting for some positive gesture of Putin. They would like to scrap the sanctions immediately. because economic cooperation is very important for many Western European countries or for America, and Russia is a very big market and a rich country. But again, we shall continue to extend the sanctions unless there is a change in the mood or change of behavior of President Putin. And he seems more and more strong, it seems to me. So I don't think that he will show his readiness to be positive partner in the solution of the different regional problems, crises, or maybe more crises of global scale. I'm trying to say something positive. But we should be realists. We should walk on the ground. No unrealistic schemes, and hard work. That's what we can do. And to use any even hints of positive behavior of Russia or some other countries, because it would help us tremendously if Russia is a serious, realistic power in several regions of the world, and if they would start cooperating with us, it would be a great help, and they don't seem to be ready as yet for that.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Here's one.
Hi there. So it's also 30 years since the commonly sort of conceived version of the internet. I was wondering if the panel could comment slightly on how they see the internet as being a future tool for unifying or aiding the European endeavour, or disrupting through different sort of political actions by creating echo chambers, things like that.
I think if there was a third option on the Brexit paper that said, I can change Europe, most people would have voted change Europe rather than either stay in or get out. But unfortunately, I think most people perceive that they can't change Europe because it isn't democratic. We don't know what manifesto we would vote for, and we don't see that as being cohesive across Europe. So we vote for our own MEPs. We have no idea how those politicians unite to actually create a European policy. What do you think the future of Europe could do to allow people on the street to become more involved with defining what that future is?
Maybe if I could answer this point now. As a European living here, I've been obviously very frustrated not just in the last 3 years, but in general. You will remember that during the Brexit or EU referendum campaign, one of the arguments that was always brought forward is that who are these people in the European Parliament? We don't even know them. I do know that a lot of European parliamentarians are trying very hard to get into the media, to be heard, to even be heard by their own parties in Westminster. And to quote someone I met in Brussels, it's like talking to a brick wall. That was inter-Labour relations between Brussels and Westminster in that case. And I think, there has been, it's undeniable, there has been a huge campaign of disinformation and of obfuscation in Britain, because the European Union was always seen as a body that one can easily blame for everything, and conversely, on the other side, on the pro-European side, therefore everything had to be just fine and dandy, because otherwise you would have run, the danger of appearing Eurosceptic, and I think that's a really unhelpful situation, a very unhealthy situation, and that I think is present in all of the member countries to some degree, but I think it's for some reason stronger here than elsewhere. But if you were talking about democratic reform, I mean, as a frustrated European citizen living here, there's one kind of democratic reform that I think would be hugely transformational, but that is not popular to talk about. though I think for the wrong reasons, which is that, you know, we have this weird situation where we have freedom of movement and yet you can only vote. I know I'm starting this can of worms there, but you know, you can only vote in the place where you're from, that is on your passport. But obviously there's a big reason, you know, like as an Austrian I can't have dual citizenship. There's a good reason for me to keep Austrian citizenship. However, that means I'm democratically excluded here. I should have been able, I think, to be voting in the Brexit referendum, but I also think I should be able, you know, no taxation without representation, to vote where I work. It would be fairly easy to see who lives where. You know, most countries have a registration system, everyone has a tax code. So I think that would really empower people who move around, and I think even if some, you know, people who are more of a maybe nationalistic frame of mind in certain parts of Europe don't think that sounds palatable. I know that there's a lot of, for example, Eastern Europeans over here that would not be discriminated against so much, would not get beaten up on the street, would not be victimized by the media if they had the right to vote, because then all of a sudden they would be very interesting as citizens and as people to address and make policy for. So that, I think, would be my very plain, you know, as someone who's not involved in the EU, but feels disenfranchised as a European citizen, that would be my call for reform. Give voting rights to people where they pay taxes and where they live. And, you know, with regards to your question about the influence of the internet, I think you're quite right. We all haven't foreseen, and, you know, I'm probably too old, but I already felt too old for it when it started out, and I feel now really bad that I didn't then hold my own when all the tech utopians came around and told us that it was all going to be so much more peaceful and democratic and so on. But, you know, obviously, if you have some if you have a free-for-all, then the people who can invest most money into that free-for-all will come out the most powerful, and that's exactly what has happened. We've created the perfect, you know, the perfect fundament for monopolization, and we know that the economics of social media work in a way that controversy and discord creates the most clicks and therefore is most beneficial to the economic model. I'm telling you nothing new here now, but therefore I see the way the internet is structured right now, I see it as a force that will unfortunately not bring us together as we once thought. And as a slight addendum to that, I am slightly, you know, also now talking as someone involved in the arts. I think what's happened with, what was it, Article 13, and so, you know, I find there is a way in which the European Union seems to find it hard to communicate with people. Sometimes, you know, I still see, especially for someone who lives in Britain, the European Union as at the moment, the only political force that is able in some way to create, to exert pressure on the Googles and the Facebooks and so on, but is very bad at communicating to people that might be to their good, because everyone then sees that as a political power grab. So if there was some way of, you know, maybe getting people involved in the industry who are not part of those conglomerates to have more input on the decision of the European Union in a transparent way, then people could trust it more. And that would maybe be beneficial, yeah.
Yeah, I have a similar opinion, maybe because I'm dealing with the countries where internet is not so popular, that I can see how the fake news and, you know, the Google policy and how the campaigns is made in the internet, that actually it doesn't bring us to more democratic society, but rather, you know, the societies which are more prone on influence on different actors, but not acting in the name of the community or the interest of the community. And like speaking about the democratic deficit in the European Union, I think one problem is that it is this kind of blame game against the European institution. So somehow, you know, and I think it is especially seen here in Great Britain, but also in the Balkans and in some other countries, that it is always good to blame the European Union. So we are always focusing about the deficits and the problems in European Union, not speaking about the how the common strong European institution protect us from the different challenges, especially when you mention that only common European institution can challenge the global and some others, let's say international actors or international enterprise, which are definitely more stronger than most of the national states in the European Union. So I think this is also one this is the problem with communication, as we said, that we think that, like, I think that the European institutions somehow are not conducting the proper communication strategy, and there is nobody who is protecting Europe as such and European institution, and that's the problem, because national states, national governments usually play against the common Europe from different reasons. And I also think that the democratic deficit is not only a problem of European Union, but as you said, it is a problem in member states, and we can see all this movement against the elites in all the region, and this is a huge problem with representation, how to address this need of more democratic influence into the institution. And we see that, well, Germany was mentioned here, that there were two parties in the power, and nobody accept them, and you know, nobody is actually addressing the problems of the societies, because we have this, you know, let's say, stable political system with the elites which are not changing and not proposing any new concept. So I think this is the problem which should be also addressed on the European member state level.
On what you mentioned, it was the common practice in Slovakia after we acceded to the European Union, and it was in other countries. Now we see it in the Western Balkans. When government achieved some progress, some good result, it took credit for it by himself. If something unpopular had to be materialized, it was they push us from the European Union. All the unpopular issues were connected with the European Union. I think that we have overcome this kind of sickness, and it's more or less okay. Concerning the Brexit, we can discuss it again and again. You said, or maybe colleagues said, that your people say, who are they in Brussels? We don't know them. I don't know whether it's the... I don't know. Do your members of the House of Commons realize that we are following them closely and we simply don't understand anything? We think it's a chaos, it's a panic. Do they understand it? Because we try to be really helpful, you know. I think Tusk said yesterday that the Brexit without Barnier, Brexit without the agreement is not possible, we shall never allow it. And we simply do not understand. Madame May came to Brussels, she spends the whole night with Jean-Claude Juncker, discussing, of course, and she got what she wanted. She returned back home, she put it on the vote, and she was defeated by 149 votes. What is her feeling? She doesn't know what her people are, how they are feeling, and so on. If she would have voted more, maybe she would have voted.
So let me clarify. In the UK, if we have a party, they have a manifesto. I understand exactly what I'm voting for because I see a list of the things they're going to do. Or they may not do those things, but actually at least I'm voting for something that I can see. When I vote for an MEP, they belong to a party which, when you combine with other parties in Europe, doesn't have really any power unless they create an alliance.
Yeah, I think that's not really true. We have two more questions. Three. One, two here. And the third one there at the back.
Thank you. Today we can hear a lot of criticism to Poland and Hungary in EU, because a lot of many voices in EU don't like their internal policy and say allegedly that it doesn't correspond to EU values. But there is no doubt that Polish and Hungarian governments are supported by their folks. And in terms of democracy, government should provide will of their people. And how is EU going to solve this collision, saving democracy and respect to each nation? Thank you.
Yes, please. And at the,
a question about culture rather than politics, although I think it's all very closely related. I went to a very interesting event about invisible poles last night at here as well. And there was a very interesting conversation about, looking back as a second, third generation Poles here, looking back at our grandparents and parents' culture that we didn't really grow up with an interest. So kind of looking back at your origins, not out of nationalistic kind of sentiments, but out of curiosity and openness. And I was wondering, going back to what you were saying, Robert, at the beginning, about this shift towards regional, local culture. Do you think it's a reflection of the kind of overarching shift that we're seeing everywhere nowadays towards nationalism, or do you see it as more of an openness, curiosity?
I think there's often concurrent movements that may have different faces, may have different political faces at the same time. Whatever, you could bring the argument that you say that when Margaret Thatcher said there's no such thing as a society, she sounded similar to what the punks were saying around the same time, and they certainly weren't singing from the same hymn sheet. And I think the same thing could be applied in this case. You have the rediscovery of, it's completely understandable with globalization that the rediscovery out of curiosity of one's own traditions can be really fruitful, really interesting, invigorating, but it can also have this other side, this parochialism side. I mean, I try to get that across, but I think really in the end, it comes down to what one makes of it, and I don't really have an answer now, but I think you have to be aware of it, of course. You have to be aware of it when you're dealing with it, that there's also this other side that you might be serving if you want to or not, and how you as with all culture, culture is so highly political. You have to be really, really careful what you do. And sorry, I just did want to come back to you because Egbert rightly said that's not true. Do you remember when the whole Spitzenkandidaten debate went around, where all of these British journalists pretended not to understand what the top candidate was, and therefore insisted on calling it Spitzenkandidat? And I do recall that, for example, the Labour Party refused to have Martin Schulz speak at their conference because they felt it wouldn't look good to have a European politician speak at their conference when there was so much Euroscepticism around. But the point would have been for him to lay out his program. So you're quite right, it does exist. You can vote for something that actually these people tour around Europe and tell you their position. It's like the European People's Party. What happened was David Cameron, for reasons that seemed to be opportune for him at the moment, decided, which is maybe that's the butterfly wing, for Brexit, that's what started it all off, was decided famously to leave the European People's Party, therefore had no influence there anymore, and then pretended that it was all undemocratic. Well, if you are in one of the biggest parties within the European Parliament and you choose to leave it, then obviously that's a loss of power. And that's what I wanted to say. I really think British people often underestimate to what a degree they're being misinformed in the media. Kicking it open door.
We have to get order. So we have here a reply is missing to your question, or do you think I was here, the gentleman in front? No? And then we have a question here in front. And if you have any further questions, you might want to raise your arms. Here, 2 more. 3 more. Okay, then I won't have to drag this out as I can as an experienced teacher, and then we'll have these 3 as the last round, and I think we can aim for closure and for refreshments. So, please.
Well, this time I would rather add some information about facts that should be taken into consideration. So first, in 2007, there was an amendment to the French Constitution, and according to that amendment, any next enlargement of the European Union must be ratified by referendum if the population of the candidate country is larger than 5% of the population of the European Union, which means never for Ukraine, never for Turkey, probably never for Serbia. Because we can guess the outcome of the referendum in France about that. So this is the legal base that exists now. Yeah? The second fact, please don't forget a deep evolution of the political system of the European Union after 2007, after the Lisbon Treaty. In 2003, the European Commission was strong enough to say to the French President, Jacques Chirac, who met Putin in Sochi, and promised him extraterritorial corridors across Lithuania to Kaliningrad region, that he shouldn't do that it is not his competence, and he should keep to the already agreed position of the European Union. At that time, the president of the European Commission was strong enough to say the thing like that to the French president. Today, he can only say that France will not be subjected to the procedures because it's France. Yeah? The founding fathers of the European communities were not mistaken when they created a system in which smaller states' voting power was overestimated. That was completely destroyed as a result of Lisbon Treaty by the reasons for which that old system existed don't disappear. Yeah? So this is another political prize. I would like to support what you have said, Mr. Minister, about rhetorics of being Europeans. Please remember when Russia invaded Georgia in the first days of August of 2008, extraordinary urgent European Council was convoked 1 month later. Why? Because of holidays. Nobody wanted to sacrifice holidays. Yeah? This is the level of a real reaction in Europe. We are all Europeans, but not that much to sacrifice our holidays. That was repeated next year in 2009 when there were riots in Chisinau and the parliament was burning, and it was the Easter time, and no high official of European Union was ready to go to Moldavia because that was Easter time. So sorry, but that's not the case. Yeah? And to end, please remember that in the previous system there was one superior official of the European Union, the President of the European Commission. Now we have 3. And this power is, President of the European Council and the High Representative.
One of them has to be woman.
Well, what I would like to say is that this former united power was divided. The same is about the weakening of the power of the national presidency because it's not in the Union, but in the European Council. And since 2009, when Lisbon Treaty went into power, no new presidency large initiative like Northern Dimension, like Barcelona process, like l'Union pour Méditerranée, nothing was started, because there is no political potential behind presidency today. What does it mean? That means the rise of the political importance of the great powers, the reduction of the European institutions as a protection of the smaller states against the power of the great powers, and that means the centralization of the national interest of the great powers, and the European institutions started to be used as the instrument of the great powers instead of, as they used to be, the barrier against the great powers policy inside the Union. And this is one of the very important reasons of the crisis. And of course, please remember that since the failure of the French and the Dutch referendum over constitutional treaty, the idea of ever deeper union is based on the tactics to avoid the consultation of the citizens, because you know what will be the result. If you don't know, look at Ireland. Yeah? Ireland is forced to vote till the result of the referendum is acceptable by European Union. Yeah? But that is something that is an exercise that you can do and you can win, but this is something that contributed decisively to erode the prestige of the Union. And what you have said, yeah, when, about the representativeness in the European institutions, we vote for CDU, yeah, we vote for Fidesz, we vote for other national parties, and only in the European Parliament we have EPP. Nobody knows among electorate what does it mean EPP. Yeah? They vote for very national parties, and you cannot change that unless you want to have any participation in the elections. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That was very detailed. We have three more. I suggest we do these as a last round, and I may give you all an opportunity to make a last statement before we enjoy European refreshments.
Thank you. Just to follow on from this gentleman's question, you mentioned to what extent, when we discuss the Russia situation, it's a really important question, and it seems sometimes the issue just sort of disappears. It sort of becomes like a taboo, which is understandable given the history and the context. But I'm wondering, let's put it this way, does Russia have legitimate interests, for example, in terms of security, ones that might be shared with Europe, in terms of the hostility that a perception might be built on the sanctions front? And what is I suppose, when it comes to it, what is the justification for what might be perceived as an aggressive stance, that sanctions are rarely bloodless, it's often said. And the question comes down to this idea of norms and liberal values. It's often said that Russia's state, for its faults, if you were to put its percentage liberalness, it would come up pretty high, even by the most critical analysts, as a country in terms of its functions internally. It's sometimes said that. So I suppose the question really is it, to what extent are we not discussing the real issue, which is the geostrategic preferences of security and defense, rather than what is, in many ways, a very similar country in many ways? And what is, I suppose, shared and legitimate for a country such as Russia, which neighbors the rest of Europe? And I guess Russia is the larger part of Europe if you look on the map. Thank you.
Second but last, thank you.
Yes, at the time of the referendum, there was this fear that if Britain votes to leave the EU, it would open the floodgates and that the dominoes would start falling. Now that hasn't happened, partly, I guess, because the protracted negotiations put people off. But the underlying issues haven't really been resolved, and maybe I haven't followed it enough, but I haven't seen much sign of introspection or a discussion about reforming the EU, and these issues will come back. So is there some sign that maybe after the Brexit saga is over, that the EU will set aside time and devote itself to this problem?
I won't say to the topic chaos. I like chaos. I think chaos is good. For example, for the Brexit and the chaos in the European Union, I think that is the first step to become to going new, to going in the new direction. I think I feel that the time and we are live. I smell this. I can smell this. That the change is coming. Yes, that is the nature of crisis to going in the new direction. That is a call. Yes, it's a big call. The crisis, but I think that is positive, and maybe the Brexit, when it is good, the Brexit, the one thing is good, that it brings order. Yeah, it breaks the order, yes, and that is good, that is creative, that is good for the future.
Thank you for this artist impression. I think technicians do not agree. Always, please, every one of you can have a 3.2 minute statement, and then we'll be just on time. And as you know, that makes the chair happy, especially if he's from Germany.
Okay, thank you for your generosity. Concerning the question on Hungary and Poland, which you asked, you are right. Viktor Orban's strongest argument is that he is winning elections back home just like that, sometime winning with the constitutional majority, which is not good because it attracts you to do something which is not always all right. I think that these two issues, when the procedure according to Article 7 started, Poland is off. You fulfilled what was criticized by the European Commission, and no longer it is mentioned. Hungary, the dialogue started between the Commission because they are asking questions. Hungarian government can explain what they meant, and it's a long process which can go on. My only answer is that even you have the big majority which you win in the elections, it does not, it shouldn't allow you to theoretically to adopt anti-democratic moves or moves which are against the rules of the European Union. And that's the obligation of the European Commission, and that's why European Commission asked us in the Parliament to start this process in order to explain or to find out whether it is true or not, because there were concrete 14 different fields where they find that not everything is all right with the Hungarian legislation concerning the different issues. Concerning to what Professor said, I will turn it around. Still, I think that European Union is a very good project. According to this discussion, we know where the problems are. And when you know where the problem is, just remove it. So we need the people to be elected to the highest offices in the European Union who are capable, if you know about them. There are such a people. But the first step to correct the situation is really to have the right diagnosis. Then you should know how should you execute the next step. So it makes me optimistic, this discussion which you mentioned, although you were completely right that it's absolutely unacceptable that any measure is taken after 1 month, and the reasons are, as you said, because everybody was on vacation. Concerning the Russia, you mentioned it again. Of course, that would be ideal situation if Russia can be included in the positive processes in the international cooperation and the international relations. That would bring a lot of stability to the world affairs and regional affairs in many places of the world. But unfortunately, you know, those sanctions were not introduced as our pleasure or something, but at that time, really, you know, the Russian actions against Georgia, against Abkhazia, against Ukraine, it was simply not tolerable, and Kremlin didn't want to hear any proposal how to cooperate under the situation. So the only way out of this situation is to, we say, for Russia to show something that they could or would be glad to contribute to the cooperation in the global scene. I think it would be fantastic for everybody.
About the crisis and the chaos, you know, I'm dealing with the Western Balkans. Like, I really can see how the proper functioning institution can be demolished in a minute. So, like, I don't think we really should be careful about what we wish for, especially with the history not so old behind us. But I really think that we are ahead the honest and open discussion. Like, we should have open and honest discussion what European Union should be, and what we would like to, how we would like to shape it. But I think still the policy in the European Union is rather focusing on solving the ad hoc crises, which are not a problem, but you know the problem goes deeper, but nobody wants to talk them. So we are thinking about this ad hoc solution and implement them, not addressing the issue or the problems which are in the European Union should be addressed. Speaking about the Russia, I think we really would like to have the cooperative friends in the close neighborhood, but I think it's impossible, and the Russia policy is completely different, and the perception of the world order is completely different. So it's rather based on not aggression and aggressive policy towards closest neighborhood, to setting the borders or the areas of influence, and we have seen it. 2008 gas prices, then Georgia, Ukraine, Montenegro, like the influence in the election in US and in Europe. So it is, as Mr. Kukan said, I don't think we can. There are a lot of countries in the European Union which are waiting for the friendly gesture from Moscow, and the sanctions are still in place. So there is there were no any opportunity to change that. That's because the policy Russia is conducting right now, it's against of our interest, against our stability. We can see it in the Balkans that, you know, European Union is trying to set order there or some stability, and it's constantly undermined by the moves of Russia, and I rather expect more aggressive moves. We can see maybe Belarus, maybe some other countries we will see, because the regime, I don't think that the Putin is stronger, I think it's weaker, and that's why he would like to perform as the strong leader, and you know, it needs some aggressive moves to legitimize its power ahead of his people, and that's why we rather should prepare for wars and hope for the better. We will see.
May I very shortly? What you said was very important. I wanted to mention it. Yes, EU should get closer to its citizens, and the only way how to regain the credibility is to speak to the people and provide enough strong arguments. I even don't think that any information strategy, if EU performs good economic things, good economic project, which people would feel on themselves that it's bringing him something good, I think it is the most persuasive argument. And you are right, I'm going to mention Brexit again. For 3 years, Brexit took a lot of oxygen. We were killing time, producing nothing. It could have been used, or it could have been used for many more important issues. Maybe we would have been solved something. So I hope that we are going to finish it, of course, to the satisfaction of both partners, because it's going to hurt all of us. But we should try to that it hurts us less than too much. Okay.
Well, I'm going to try to be extra brief. I can't pretend to have any competency in talking about Russian affairs, really. The only thing that I know is I did go on one of those kleptocracy tours that I don't know if you've heard about them, where you get on a bus and you're being taken around London. You see.
It was at the wedding of their foreign minister.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. But you get taken around London. You see the houses where the very rich oligarchs have invested in London. Obviously, a lot of that is something that does stick in my throat. Is that slight bit of hypocrisy behind those convulsions of righteous indignation that you get every now and then about Russia. Well, at the same time, you know that especially this city has taken a lot of very dodgy Russian money very, very gratefully. And so that does stick in my throat, I have to say. But then I don't know if that's got anything to do with the sanctions. However, on your last 2 points, I think they're both connected. I think, when you said, Bärbel, when you talked about chaos being a wonderful thing, I think that really shows that you haven't been living in this country for the last 2.5 years, because Brexit has really been the most unproductive thing ever here, and nothing works anymore. Everything is stuck. No decisions are being made. So this kind of chaos is not very productive. However, I'm contradicting myself and getting back to what you're saying. Is there any chance for proper reform? My wildest dream, and we're back to this topic of the future, is if it were possible to get the British politicians or the House of Commons to agree to revoke Article 50 and then go back. You see, we've revoked. Actually, we all agree that it's better for both of you, the EU, and for us to be inside, but this means that we have to start a conversation about reform. I know, this is such an easy thing to say, but it had to be said. I'm sorry.
Okay, I thank our panelists. I thank you all for your contributions.